Okay, so now we're getting to the more advanced version of the boot sequence. And you're like, I just watched the basic one, Mr. Poole. Yep, but we got to talk about the advanced stuff too. So, when we get and we talk about BIOS loading, there's many more things than just BIOS loads. Because that's what we said before, right? BIOS loads. And it gives out system resources. And this is a list of the available system resources that are on a computer. And they're called IRQs, DMA channels, input-output addresses, and memory addresses. Different hardware devices use different ones. And during that boot process, which lasts all of a second, that you see the Dell screen go by, maybe 3 or 4 seconds, right? Or maybe longer on your computer at home. Servers take forever. But basically, the startup BIOS is going through all those components in your computer and deciding who gets what to deconflict everything so everybody gets to run. If it can't deconflict them, if you've got too many things in your computer that are trying to use the same resources, that's when you plugged in another mouse and it won't work. Why doesn't it work? Well, it's conflicting with something, possibly. So it goes through and hands out system resources as it goes through there. So when it's turned on, we already talked about this, it generates clock pulses, CPU initializes and resets itself to zeros, and then it turns on the memory and allows the BIOS to start. It then has the CPU run those post tests, the power on self tests that we already talked about. It checks the BIOS program, the post checks the BIOS program itself, checks CMOS ROM, tests for a battery failure. And when we talk about battery failure, we're not talking about a laptop battery, we're talking about that little CMOS battery. Because if the battery has failed, the BIOS knows that all the information in CMOS RAM is wrong. Because it's gone back to defaults and it's not right. So when it gets that, you get indications of a battery failure. Sometimes it says something like this: date and time not set. It's usually what we get, which is a terrible message for battery is dead. Because really that's what it's trying to tell you. And it's saying it's not set because it just went back, because it doesn't know what the date and time is, to the day this thing was made. You might get a great message like this. I've never gotten this one before. It's from an HP Compact computer. It actually says, time and date not set. The system time is invalid. This may be a result of a loss in battery power. And it's not talking about laptop battery. It's talking about that CMOS battery. Set the correct time and date using your operating system or BIOS. If the message persists, you may need to replace the onboard battery. And you're going to have to replace the onboard battery. We've had that happen a number of times where students bring in the laptop and the tech student that's fixing it, resets the date and time and sends it right back out. Well, the next time the battery dies, in this case I am talking about the laptop battery, because if the laptop battery is good, it will hold the data in there until the laptop battery is dead, because the CMOS battery already is. It happens again. They got to bring it back in. So whenever you see something like that, this is what we get on the Dell. It says, time of day not set, please run the setup program, or strike F1 to continue, which is what people usually do. Either they sit there and go, I don't know, or they hit F1 and it just starts, and I get a work order that says, hey, every day I have to hit F1 to boot my computer. I'm like, well, you need a battery. It's a $2 thing. We'll get down there and get a battery in there for you. So it does that battery check, and that's what it's talking about. It checks the settings in BIOS to see if they're all default. And if they are, it assumes that the battery is probably bad, because they wouldn't be default date and time. And if it's good, it continues on. At that point, you have that little bit of time when you see that Dell screen to hit F2 to enter BIOS. After it gets past that boot point, the hardware interrupts are disabled, meaning you can do whatever you want to the keyboard now. It's saying, we're not listening. We're doing our stuff right now. Pressing any key on the keyboard or using any input device will do nothing, will not affect anything. It's running its tests on the CPU, finishing the initialization, checks if it's a cold boot. We've already talked about this a little bit, right? Checks the RAM if it's a cold boot, and then installs all those hardware devices and checks those as well. If it's a warm boot, you can't install a hardware device while it's rebooting, right? So it doesn't need to check those again. It already did that on the last cold boot to see what was there. Assigns those video resources, and then after it's done all those things, now is when you can get into BIOS, but you had to have asked before. And that's why it has, for a limited amount of time, it says hit F2 to enter BIOS. And if you don't, you see a whole bunch of BIOS stuff and then Windows loads. And if you do, you still see a whole bunch of BIOS stuff and then all of a sudden it stops and BIOS comes up because you hit it when you had a chance. And now, before it loads the operating system, it goes, oh, you wanted to do some settings. Here you go. And you get presented with a BIOS screen. If you didn't do that, that's when BIOS is all ready. It searches for the operating system wherever you told it to look in your system setup. And I say you, I mean whoever set it up, right? You, meaning a human, had to go in and set the boot order in BIOS that BIOS now is looking for the operating system in the boot order. So the startup BIOS looks to the CMOS to determine what device it wants us to boot from based on the order that we put in. And then it looks for that master boot record on those devices. So we set up that list of, hey, look here, then look here, then look here. And it looks at those in those order so that it looks for something it can boot from. If you say it's going to be a flash drive, then a boot record has to be on this flash drive that you've set it up that way or wherever you want it to boot from. So it's real important that we set it up in the order that's best for us. So it looks for that boot record, then it finds the operating system and it loads it into memory. If you remember from chapter 1, the difference between primary and secondary storage. Secondary storage is that permanent storage, hard drives, flash drives, CD-ROMs, that the CPU cannot talk to. So it takes the information on that permanent secondary storage, loads it into the primary storage or memory, and then the CPU can interact with it and load it, and it can load Windows. So the slower our secondary storage is, the harder it is to get it into primary storage, and the longer it takes the computer to load it, which is why some people that have traditional hard drives get so upset about how long it takes for Windows to load, because it's loading into memory. Once it's in memory, if you have a lot of memory, it's going to run almost as fast as one that's on a solid state drive. So this is a graphic of what it's doing. Basically, it's the BIOS program is looking in the CMOS chip. It's loading that information from the CMOS chip to say, where should I look for the operating system? Do it in this order. And the better we set up the order, the faster it will get to find it and then load it. And that's why we have on your laptops, the hard drive is first, the network is second. We don't even have the CD-ROM turned on because we don't expect you to be loading an operating system from a CD-ROM here at Trail. That master boot record on a physical disk is in an exact location, but on anything else, it's just loaded in there in a table in memory on a flash drive or on a solid state drive that it loads from. That operating system, as I've already said, is what allows us to interact with our hardware. It's what makes it all worth it. Without a good operating system, your hardware is worthless. Windows Vista, I didn't mention that one because we never used it, came out terribly in its initial release, and everyone hated Windows Vista when it came out, and you guys may be too young to remember Windows Vista, but it made perfectly good things run perfectly terrible. It manages the hardware. It lets us run our application. It provides the interface, what's called a graphical user interface, or a GUI. GUI is graphical user interface. The operating system provides that graphical user interface to us that is Windows 10, and allows us to store, retrieve, and manipulate files, right? So that's the purpose of the operating system. Allows us to use our hardware, allows us to run programs, allows us to store and retrieve stuff.